It was the spring of 1944, and the rolling fields of central Texas were bathed in a muted golden light. Rows of wooden barracks stretched in precise, regimented lines across the flat terrain, their pale exteriors punctuated by neatly trimmed lawns and tidy walkways. Birds called softly from the nearby mesquite trees, their songs weaving through the rhythmic clatter of boots on wooden floors. German prisoners of war, recently transported from the battlefields of Europe, stepped off the freight cars for the first time in this vast, unfamiliar land. Their eyes, sharp and cautious, scanned the orderly camp with disbelief. There were no barbed wires bristling like weapons of warning, no armed guards patrolling every corner. Instead, there were Americans in simple khaki uniforms, offering polite nods, guiding the bewildered newcomers with gestures of quiet assurance. The scent of fresh bread from the mess hall mingled with the earthy aroma of sun, warmed soil, and the distant laughter of men at leisure carried across the compound, strange and disarming. For soldiers hardened by war, accustomed to the chaos and deprivation of the front lines, this calm, almost surreal civility was alien. Their hands, trained to clutch rifles, now hesitated at the sight of neatly stacked beds, lined with crisp sheets and pillows fluffed to perfection. Whispered German murmurs passed between them, questioning, doubting, struggling to reconcile the reality before them with the fearsome tales of enemy cruelty they had internalized for years. Here, in this remote corner of Texas, history itself seemed to pause. And for the first time, these men confronted a simple truth: war was not just destruction. It was also the fragile possibility of humanity. Inside the camp, the rhythm of daily life moved with a precision that seemed almost mechanical to the German prisoners, yet it was infused with an unmistakable sense of calm and order. For men who had known the chaos of battlefields, the unpredictable terror of air raids, and the constant hunger and filth of war-torn Europe, this was a revelation, almost surreal in its consistency. They arrived at the mess hall each morning to the sight of long, neatly arranged tables, trays stacked with dishes of steaming food, the aroma of fresh bread, roasted meats, and simmering stews carrying across the room in an almost tangible wave. Soldiers moved with a disciplined ease, yet there was no rigidity in their manner, no harsh commands barked across the hall. Instead, a quiet professionalism guided every motion. Plates slid down counters on metal racks, servers offered polite smiles, and the prisoners watched, sometimes incredulous, sometimes silently skeptical. Some of the prisoners, still clinging to the fear and suspicion ingrained in them by years of indoctrination, approached their trays cautiously, inspecting the food as though it might be poisoned or laced with some hidden trap. Others dared a tentative taste, their eyes widening in astonishment as the flavors proved unexpectedly rich and satisfying. They had endured hunger on a scale that seemed unimaginable here. Half-starved marches across Eastern European plains, meager rations of bread that crumbled in their hands, the bitter taste of thin soup, the gnawing emptiness of days without sufficient sustenance. Now, here in the Texas sun, they found abundance, not wasteful, but generous, consistent, and offered without condescension. It was a shock not only to their senses, but to their understanding of what an enemy could be. As they ate, they noticed that the Americans did not stand over them, that there were no guards poised with rifles, no suspicion lingering in the air. Instead, the soldiers who had captured them moved among them as guides and helpers. A young American with rolled-up sleeves handed out extra servings to a hesitant man, nodding with a quiet encouragement that suggested, rather than demanded, compliance. A nurse paused to adjust a blanket over the shoulders of a shivering prisoner, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead, a gesture so ordinary and yet so astonishing to a man trained to expect cruelty at every turn. In these moments, the prisoners felt the first tremors of cognitive dissonance, the beginnings of a realization that their expectations, formed over years of war and propaganda, were being appended in ways they had never imagined possible. The murmurs of German words passed quietly from table to table, voices low and cautious, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile trust forming in the room. Some whispered in disbelief, "How can they treat us like this?" Others shook their heads, unable to reconcile the friendliness, the politeness, the very humanity extended toward them with the image of Americans as merciless, heartless soldiers. And yet the evidence lay before them: warm food, clean dishes, a respectful nod, a gentle smile. Some prisoners, emboldened by curiosity more than trust, even dared to engage in small conversation, exchanging clipped words in broken English or gestures with their captors, tentative bridges across the gulf of language and wartime enmity. Each interaction, no matter how small, was a revelation, a subtle dismantling of the walls that fear and indoctrination had erected around them. Even beyond the mess hall, the camp itself reinforced this extraordinary sense of order and decency. The walkways were swept daily, lined with grass and flowers carefully tended, their colors vivid against the pale wooden barracks. The prisoners, initially hesitant to leave the paths, gradually ventured further into the camp, noting the neatness of each corner, the soft rustle of leaves in the spring breeze, the distant sounds of workmen maintaining fences or painting trim. It was not just cleanliness for appearance's sake. It was a reflection of care, a tangible manifestation of respect for both the environment and its inhabitants, a concept almost alien to men who had survived European winter encampments where mud and disease dominated every surface. During mealtimes, the scene repeated with subtle variations, each day reinforcing a sense of normalcy that bordered on the miraculous for the prisoners. Hot stews were ladled generously, trays balanced on calloused hands as the Americans offered help and guidance. A man who had not tasted meat in weeks found himself cutting into a thick slice of roast, savoring it. Over time, the prisoners began to notice the nuances that made the experience so remarkable. The arrangement of the trays, the careful portioning of food, the unobtrusive guidance of the guards. These were not accidental, they were deliberate efforts to maintain dignity, to teach order, to model respect. And slowly, the German soldiers responded, their initial skepticism giving way to curiosity, and curiosity to a cautious appreciation. Some began helping themselves to extra servings not out of need, but out of acknowledgement that they were allowed to do so without fear of punishment. Others observed their fellow prisoners with a mixture of envy and wonder, silently noting who adjusted their own bed linens, who lined up quietly for food, who offered a hand to a newcomer unsure of the procedure. In this microcosm of civility, social norms were being reshaped, and the prisoners, whether they realized it or not, were absorbing lessons in dignity, patience, and trust. Even the smallest gestures resonated deeply. A guard would quietly refill a water pitcher at the end of the line, ensuring no one went thirsty. A young American soldier, pausing mid-step, offered a warm towel to a man freshly washed, an act so simple and unremarkable to the giver, yet extraordinary to the recipient who had long been denied comfort or care. These details, seemingly trivial, accumulated in the prisoner's consciousness, forming a mosaic of a reality that contradicted every expectation they had carried from Europe. They began to understand, piece by piece, that civility was not weakness, that kindness was not a trap, and that it was possible, even during war, to be treated with respect and fairness. Over the weeks, these moments of human decency became not just surprising, but transformative. The prisoners grew accustomed to the predictable rhythms of the camp, the organized meals, the polite interactions, the absence of threat. Where once there had been fear and suspicion, now there was cautious engagement. They helped with small chores, folding linens, cleaning tables, and carrying trays, not because they were commanded, but because they began to internalize the camp's ethos of responsibility and care. Each action, Each polite exchange, each shared laugh chipped away at the ingrained notion that survival demanded cruelty, that enemies could not be trusted to act humanly. And through it all, the prisoners learned that it was possible to exist in a world structured not by fear, but by order and decency. They began to feel a new kind of strength, not from weapons or strategy, but from the quiet, unassuming power of human kindness and the calm certainty of routine. For the first time in years, men who had only known the relentless pressure of combat discovered that life could be orderly, comfortable, and even joyful, even in captivity. Each day, each meal, each interaction became an affirmation that humanity persisted even in the shadow of global conflict. And that trust, once earned, could be returned. In the long hours of dining, in the steady rhythm of service, in the quiet smiles of guards and prisoners alike, the German soldiers confronted an astonishing truth. The enemy they had feared was capable of generosity, patience, and compassion, and that the most powerful weapon they possessed was not force, but civility. Recreation in the American POW camps was a revelation that the German prisoners could hardly have imagined, a quiet defiance of everything they had been taught about captivity and the nature of the enemy. In the mornings, the air was alive with the distant sound of a volleyball being struck back and forth, the rhythmic thump echoing across the neatly mown grass fields that surrounded the camp. American soldiers moved with an easy familiarity through this space, tossing balls, laughing, and calling out instructions to one another, their gestures casual, unguarded. The German men observed from the sidelines at first, unsure how to interpret these sounds of leisure, the light-hearted competition that seemed almost frivolous in a world they had known to be defined by survival and fear. They hesitated at the edges of the fields, hands clasped behind their backs, eyes scanning for some hidden threat, some sudden punishment that might emerge from this seemingly impossible freedom. Slowly, curiosity overcame caution. A few men took tentative steps toward the court, their boots sinking slightly into the soft earth, eyes following the ball as it asked through the air. One prisoner, tall and wary, stretched his arms awkwardly to catch a serve, the motion foreign and ungainly after months spent gripping rifles and bayonets. Yet the laughter that erupted when he stumbled or fumbled was not mocking, it was inclusive, inviting, and unmistakably genuine. Others joined in. At first reluctantly, then with increasing confidence, their competitive instincts emerging despite the novelty of the environment. The simple act of chasing a ball across grass without fear of injury or punishment felt astonishing, almost revolutionary. Some of the prisoners discovered a joy in movement, the exhilaration of physical exertion for pleasure rather than survival, a feeling that they had not experienced since childhood, before the war had reshaped every moment of their lives. Beyond games, the camp offered a range of activities designed to occupy the prisoners' time, minds, and spirits. Music classes drew men to small rooms where pianos, violins, and guitars awaited, instruments meticulously maintained and in good repair. At first, many were hesitant to touch them, unfamiliar with the concept that art could be a tool for solace rather than propaganda. Yet under the guidance of patient instructors, German soldiers began to experiment tentatively, plucking strings and striking keys, listening with astonishment to the melodies they produced. The sounds seemed to echo differently in the open, quiet spaces of the camp compared to the hollow, bombed-out buildings of Europe they had endured. Music, laughter, and conversation blended into a tapestry of sound that became both comforting and disorienting, a constant reminder that the enemy was capable of fostering creativity and human expression rather than solely destruction. Art classes, too, offered another avenue for expression. Prisoners were provided with pencils, paper, and paints, encouraged to sketch the camp, landscapes, or even portraits of their fellow soldiers. At first, their drawings were tentative, stiff, constrained by the habits of military life. Over time, however, the prisoners began to capture small details with surprising skill: the curve of a tree branch, the angle of sunlight on a barrack, the careful alignment of a row of benches. These images were more than mere depictions. They were acts of observation, of reflection, of acknowledgement of beauty in a setting that had seemed impossible to find. In the soft light of late afternoons, as shadows stretched across the fields, men bent over their work, absorbed in a quiet focus, the steady scratch of pencil or brushstroke becoming a meditative rhythm that eased the tension in their shoulders and the weariness etched into their faces. For those who preferred quiet reflection to activity, letters and journals provided another outlet. The camp administration allowed prisoners to correspond with family, a privilege that carried immense emotional weight. Men sat at small desks, pen in hand, pausing frequently to gather their thoughts, to remember voices, faces, and places they feared they might never see again. The act of writing was both grounding and therapeutic, offering a tether to a world outside the fences, a sense of continuity and hope in a time dominated by upheaval. The prisoners marveled at the freedom they had to express themselves without censorship or punishment, realizing that even within the constraints of captivity, they could retain a part of their humanity, a sense of self, and a connection to those they loved. Gradually, the German soldiers began to internalize the lessons of recreation and structured freedom. They learned that physical exertion, artistic expression, and intellectual engagement were not luxuries, but vital tools for maintaining morale and mental well-being. They started to approach activities with increasing confidence, their initial hesitancy replaced by anticipation and enjoyment. Friendly competitions emerged in volleyball games, often accompanied by bursts of laughter and playful banter. Music ensembles formed, drawing together men of different ranks and experiences to create harmony in a setting that had previously known only discord. Sketching and painting became daily rituals, small acts of reclaiming personal agency and pride within the controlled confines of interactions between prisoners and guards further reinforced this sense of normalcy and mutual respect. American soldiers often joined games, providing instruction and encouragement, modeling sportsmanship and fair play. They offered subtle guidance in music lessons, suggesting techniques without criticism, and praised artistic endeavors with sincere admiration. The Germans were initially wary of such attention, trained to suspect ulterior motives, yet over time they recognized the genuine intent behind these gestures. Trust, slow to build, began to solidify, and in that trust the prisoners found not only safety but a remarkable sense of liberation. As the days passed, the camp itself seemed to transform before their eyes. Open fields became familiar territories. Rooms and classrooms felt like spaces of possibility rather than confinement, and the rhythm of organized recreation provided a counterpoint to the rigidity of military routine. Prisoners developed informal schedules, anticipating specific times for games, lessons, or quiet reflection, the predictability offering comfort in a world still defined by war. They began to notice subtle patterns: the way shadows moved across the fields in the afternoon, the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze, the consistent laughter that marked a volleyball match or a piano lesson. And these small, recurring moments fostered a sense of stability that had been absent for years. Perhaps the most profound transformation was internal. The men realized that joy, creativity, and leisure were not weaknesses to be exploited or threats to be punished. They began to experience freedom in its most understated forms: the freedom to move, to create, to laugh, to choose, and to connect. In the smiles shared across a volleyball net, in the cautious notes played on an instrument, in the delicate shading of a sketch, the prisoners discovered a profound human truth: that even in captivity, even during war, it was possible to reclaim a fragment of life untouched by fear and violence. Even those who remained skeptical or withdrawn could not help but notice the subtle shifts in their surroundings and in themselves. Perhaps the most astonishing aspect of life in the American POW camps was the living quarters themselves. The German prisoners, conditioned for overcrowded, unsanitary, and often freezing accommodations in European detention centers, could scarcely believe the order and care evident in every barrack. Sunlight streamed through open windows in the morning, illuminating rooms that were clean, quiet, and thoughtfully arranged. Bunks lined the walls in precise rows, each topped with crisp sheets and neatly fluffed pillows, a detail so meticulous that it seemed almost ceremonial to men accustomed to the haphazard, shared bedding of previous camps. The prisoners took tentative steps inside these spaces, their boots echoing softly against polished floors, and paused to absorb the strange sense of comfort. The air was warm, slightly scented with fresh linens and the faint tang of wood polish, a stark contrast to the damp, moldy smells that had haunted them in Europe. Each prisoner was assigned a small space that offered privacy and a measure of autonomy. There were desks for writing letters, personal storage for belongings, and hooks for hanging clothing. For many men, the ability to manage even a modest personal space was a revelation. They handled their few possessions carefully, placing them in drawers or on shelves with a deliberate reverence. There was no fear that a fellow prisoner or guard would interfere or confiscate these items. The structure of the camp fostered responsibility, not punishment. Slowly, habits formed around care and organization. Beds were made meticulously each morning, laundry folded and stored, shoes polished. Small rituals that gave a sense of agency in a world that had previously dictated every movement. Even simple acts, such as straightening a chair or adjusting a curtain to allow sunlight in, became opportunities to participate in a system of order and respect. A system in which the prisoner was not merely an object of control, but a participant in maintaining dignity. The outdoor environment mirrored this attention to detail. Walkways were swept daily, lined with flowers and shrubs carefully maintained. Lawns trimmed with precision. Prisoners quickly noticed the effort that went into creating a visually harmonious setting. Small trees were planted in rows, gardens tended, and fences painted in neat, unbroken lines. Guards encouraged the men to take pride in these spaces, often inviting them to participate in maintenance work, teaching techniques for planting, trimming, and painting. What had begun as an unusual opportunity to exercise control over one's immediate environment gradually became a source of pride, an empowering counterpoint to the helplessness the prisoners had previously known. Each completed task brought satisfaction and a subtle boost to morale, fostering a sense of accomplishment that had been impossible in the chaos of war. Inside the barracks, routines reinforced this environment of care and dignity. Men awoke each day to the same rhythms: beds made, personal spaces tidied, breakfast in the mess hall, followed by assigned duties around the camp. The precision of these routines was comforting rather than oppressive. Prisoners who had spent months or even years in unpredictable, harsh conditions came to value the predictability, the certainty that small, orderly tasks would be respected, and that attention to detail would be rewarded, not mocked. For many, this was the first time they had experienced the stability of routine without fear of sudden violence or arbitrary punishment. The structure offered a psychological anchor, a sense that, despite the war raging across oceans, life in this confined space could be manageable and even humane. The act of caring for their living quarters also fostered interpersonal connections. Men shared advice on arranging furniture, storing belongings in camps, an affirmation of dignity expressed not through grand gestures, but through consistent, tangible care. As weeks and months passed, these routines became second nature. Men awoke, tidied their quarters, and participated in camp life with a growing sense of pride. Tasks that initially felt foreign or even unnecessary became sources of satisfaction. Folding a blanket just so, arranging a few personal belongings, or painting a fence with care became opportunities to assert agency, to participate in the creation of a stable, humane environment. The prisoners came to understand that their cooperation, attention, and care were recognized and respected, and that the act of maintaining order was itself an assertion of autonomy. Over time, the impact of these conditions extended beyond the barracks and the immediate environment. Prisoners began to take greater care of themselves, showering regularly, maintaining uniforms, tending to minor ailments with the guidance of medical staff. The simple act of self-care, facilitated by the supportive environment, became intertwined with broader routines of the camp. Men who had arrived sullen, mistrustful, and weary now displayed a quiet confidence, their demeanor reflecting the sense of safety and structure fostered by the camp's attention to detail. Psychological resilience emerged gradually as the prisoners discovered that discipline could coexist with dignity, and that order need not be oppressive to be effective. The cumulative effect of these experiences was profound. The prisoners learned that captivity need not entail degradation, that structured freedom and humane treatment could coexist, and that respect for individuals, no matter their status as captives, was possible even during wartime. They began to internalize these lessons, understanding that their daily choices, their care for personal and shared spaces, and their engagement with structured routines contributed to a culture of civility that defined the camp. The act of participating in this system, rather than merely being subjected to it, offered an empowering sense of control and identity, fostering hope for the future in a time of global chaos. Even on days when tensions rose, perhaps due to minor disputes or the natural frustration of confinement, the environment of the barracks and the surrounding grounds acted as a stabilizing force. Prisoners were reminded through the physical order, the predictable routines, and the visible care of the Americans around them that cooperation and respect were not abstract ideals. They were practices embedded in every aspect of camp life. The impact of this and maintaining cleanliness. Older prisoners guided younger men, demonstrating techniques for folding linens or polishing floors, while conversations flowed about distant families, hopes for post-war life, and small observations about the camp's evolving landscape. Trust grew slowly but steadily. Prisoners discovered that cooperation could yield tangible benefits, that assistance was freely given, and that the shared goal of maintaining order fostered camaraderie. Even men who had been strangers or rivals learned to respect one another through these daily routines, creating bonds that were forged not in battle, but in the quiet labor of sustaining dignity and human decency. Meals in the barracks also reflected this sense of care. Unlike the crowded, chaotic lines of European camps, food distribution here was orderly, predictable, and generous. Each man knew where to go, how to collect his tray, and how to return it afterward. Many prisoners took the opportunity to learn proper etiquette. Even for something as simple as carrying a tray or stacking dishes, internalizing lessons that would have seemed absurd or unnecessary on the front lines. The process was unhurried, allowing men to focus not only on nourishment, but on the simple act of participating in a civilized routine. The experience reinforced a sense of normalcy, a feeling that life, even in captivity, could be structured with dignity, consistency, and mutual respect. Beyond the immediate environment, the barracks were a microcosm of broader social and psychological stability. Men were encouraged to personalize their spaces within limits, placing letters, sketches, or small tokens on desks or shelves. These small expressions of individuality reinforced identity and morale, reminding the prisoners that they were still human beings with thoughts, preferences, and creativity, not merely numbers or prisoners to be controlled. The camp administration recognized the importance of mental being. And the results were evident. Prisoners engaged in activities with increasing confidence, maintained their spaces with care, and participated in communal life with a sense of shared responsibility. The barracks became a stage upon which civility, order, and self-respect were practiced daily. Even the smallest details were purposeful and impactful. Windows were left open to allow sunlight and fresh air. Curtains hung neatly to frame views of the camp's orderly grounds. Beds were positioned to maximize comfort and warmth, and furniture was maintained in good repair. Prisoners noted that no corner of the barracks was neglected. The careful attention to every aspect of their environment conveyed a subtle but powerful message: their well-being mattered. In these spaces, men began to internalize a sense of worth that had been systematically eroded in European approach, extended into interpersonal dynamics as well. Men treated each other with increasing civility, guided younger or less experienced prisoners, and formed bonds based on shared participation rather than fear or coercion. By the end of their captivity, many German prisoners reflected on the barracks and the surrounding grounds with a mix of awe and gratitude. They had been immersed in a world where order, dignity, and respect were constant, not exceptions, where individual agency was recognized and nurtured, and where human decency was embedded in the very structures and routines of daily life. This environment left an indelible impression on them, a testament to the power of consistent care and organization in shaping human behavior, even under the extraordinary circumstances of war. In